Today, I was invited to the White House. I was honored to go to the White House again and be included in a small meeting with our President, President Trump. And it was very clear I was invited to the White House to stand firm with President Trump today. We talked about immigration, Mr. President, and today I was proud to stand with our President. We've been very crystal clear, actually. Chain migration must end, period. Any solution to our current immigration crisis that the United States Senate will consider must include ending chain migration. Before I talk about the details of what chain migration is, I want to put it in perspective. Our immigration crisis today has been long-standing. The last laws, we had a law written in 1965. We had other changes in '86, but it's been really since '91 of any meaningful immigration change. 3 times in the last 11 years, Mr. President, well-intended people in this body and in the House have done a yeoman's job of trying to solve the comprehensive problem of immigration in the United States without success. And here we are again right now facing a deadline that the President has put on, and rightfully so, that we have a sense of urgency. The President's done a couple of things. He's defined the scope of the problem, and he's defined a sense of urgency for the people in Congress. But the legal immigration system right now is broken. But to deal with that, we have to deal with our entire immigration system in pieces. The reason I believe that most of these past efforts have failed is because they try to do a comprehensive solution, Mr. President. Today, we're really breaking into 3 areas. One, our legal immigration system. Second would be, the next step might be our temporary work visas. We bring in about 1.1 million legal immigrants a year today. I'll talk about how that relates historically. But our temporary work visas, we issue about 2.2 million temporary work visas a year. And then the third issue is, of course, the people who are in the United States illegally. President Trump had a meeting 2 days ago in the White House. In that meeting, he had Democrats, Republicans, members of the House, members of this body, the Senate, and he drove consensus in that meeting. It was very interesting, Mr. President, that he had the media in there for almost 60 minutes for an open dialogue. And we heard from all people in that room about their position on these topics. I thought it was very interesting that the President had the courage to put this issue in front of the American people and create an air of transparency that we have not had on this issue in decades. And in that meeting, he drove 2 conclusions. 1, a scope of the problem, and 2, a sense of urgency. The scope is very simply defined as we have to address the DACA situation. March 5th, the President has, we have a date there that the President has given the Congress in order to come up with a solution for these individuals who are in the country illegally, but not of their doing. The second issue is border security. We know that border security right now is a national security issue as much as it is an immigration issue. The good news is that we know that illegal crossings of our southern border anyway are down dramatically this year just because of a couple of reasons. One is the enforcement of current law, and the second is an understanding around the world that we are going to deal with this issue. The third piece of the scope is chain migration. Any solution to the DACA situation or the legal immigration situation must include addressing the chain migration issue. And the last is this archaic diversity lottery that we have, visa lottery that we have in the United States, that was related to at least one of the terrorist attacks, and chain migration was involved in both of the terrorist attacks that we have recently experienced here in the United States. With regard to DACA, the first item on the scope, we know we have a March 5th deadline. There is a growing consensus in this body, Mr. President, of how to deal with that. And there's great latitude on the part of Republicans in this body to deal with that in a way with our Democratic partners here to get a consensus bill that solves this once and for all. The second is border security. And here I will tell you, with the President's leadership and in these recent meetings with Democrats and members of the House, there's a growing consensus there that we can deal with the national security issues related to our southern border. We don't need a 2,000-mile wall, Mr. President, as even the President of the United States has said just this week. But there are things that we need to do, and we need to do them quick. The president today said that his goal is to get this done this year. Coming from the real world, I know that's possible. This president, who comes from the real world, an outsider to this community here in Washington, he knows that's possible. And I think he's going to hold us accountable to that. The third area that I mentioned before is chain migration. I'll say more about that in a minute. And the fourth is diversity lottery. This diversity lottery has not served us well. It's 50,000 people. It's not the number. It's the way it's being handled. We know there's fraud in there, and we know that this is a loophole that terrorists are now using to put people in their chain inside the United States. But there's a growing consensus on these four areas, these four items of this scope that the president has defined, and we had a consensus in that room the other day, 2 days ago, in the White House. There is consensus that we can get to a solution within the time frame here. But let me be very clear. Any deal, whether it's in business, sports, or certainly in politics, has to have some symmetry, Mr. President. Therefore, any solution for the DACA situation must include a solution for our chain migration crisis. We must continue working with the President, Mr. President. He is holding us accountable. He's moving at a business pace. But to do that, we've really got to talk about chain migration. And I understand there are other areas that we've got to talk about as well, but this is one, there's a lot of disinformation about what it really is. Chain migration is nothing more than a law that was put in place in 1965 to allow legal permanent residents and U.S. citizens to sponsor people for U.S. citizenship. It was put in place in 1965. It's been updated a little bit, but today, a legal permanent resident, and for the most part, this is someone that has come in and qualified in our legal immigration system that goes through a 5-year waiting period who eventually can apply for U.S. citizenship. While they're a legal permanent resident, Mr. President, almost immediately they can sponsor spouses, minor children, and unmarried adult children. That's current law. Once they become a citizen, and this is true of any U.S. citizen, whether they were a recent immigrant or were born here, a citizen, U.S. citizen, can sponsor their parents, their spouses, minor children, unmarried adult children, married adult children, and siblings. And the issue around this, Mr. President, is pretty simple. We have a chart here that shows that in 1965, when this law was put in place, there were approximately 300,000 U.S. citizens were brought in the United States in that year under this system. Last year, we roughly had about 1.1 million. We've had a high of somewhere close to 1.3 million, but you can see this is a geometric progression, Mr. President, that increases unbounded, and it's not really the number here, but it's the balance that we've lost. What happens here, Mr. President, the criticism I have as a business guy looking at this is is that the individuals who determine who future immigrants are going to be are current and recent immigrants. We don't have many guidelines. We have a country cap system that says that most countries have a percentage of the total that they have to have, and they can't exceed that, but there's no real cap here, such that if all these numbers were maximized, then over time you would see this number go up geometrically. We have a second chart, Mr. President, that actually shows this and demonstrates that over a very short period of time, the numbers can increase dramatically, as we've seen over the last 40 or so years. But there have been studies on this. Princeton has a study that says that right now, based on recent history, that any immigrant who comes in sponsors somewhere around 3.5 future immigrants within a short period of time. Now, we don't know what the 3.5 immigrants do when they get sponsored and become citizens or legal permanent residents. But if you extrapolate this out, let's say that we start with 2 million as a starting point here, and they become citizens, and they sponsor, let's just say the number is 3. Well, in the first iteration, now we have 6 million people sponsored by the original 2 million, or 2 million. And then the second iteration, you go from 6 to 18, and in the fourth iteration, Mr. President, you're at 54 million people. So all of a sudden, you can see there is no limit here other than the country caps, and the country caps do not limit the total number. They limit the mix. Well, what's wrong with this system? Well, the problem I said just now is that future immigrants are determined by current immigrants without any regard to their ability to participate in the system. The second one is that because you can bring parents in, Immigrants who come into this system, become U.S. citizens, can bring their parents in, and all of a sudden now we have an aged population coming in, not a younger population, who then draw social services on an already bankrupt system. Chain migration is not based on skill or the ability to participate in the current economic situation here in the United States. Today, or last year, we brought in 1.1 million immigrants, Mr. President. Of that, 140,000 were immigrants that were related to the worker. 70,000 were the worker, and the other 70,000 were their immediate family. And so you can see that over 950,000 people were derivative iterations of the thing I'm talking about. The third thing is that chain migration, if it's not stopped, continues to incentivize future illegal immigration because of what you can do once you get here. Chain migration is another problem with the DACA situation, because if you permit a pathway to some sort of legalized situation here in the United States for the DACA population, you end up with a situation where those people who are then legalized can sponsor their parents. The problem with that is the DACA population have not violated federal law, Mr. President, but their parents have. The last issue I would bring up is that the national security issues are profound. We've seen 2 national security incidents just this past year related to chain migration and the diversity visa lottery. There's more than enough evidence to show that this has to be addressed. Mr. President, again, any symmetric deal on immigration has to include, I believe, the 4 points that the President talked about the other day. We have to deal with the DACA situation. We have to deal with our border security, and that means building a wall, Mr. President. We have to deal with the chain migration issue, and we have to deal with this diversity visa lottery. The President demands it. The people, American people, demand it. Today, as a matter of fact, over 80% of America believes that we need to deal with the DACA situation. Likewise, 72% of people in America believe that the immigration law should be the worker, the spouse, and their immediate minor children only. 72%, Mr. President. I can't think of another issue that's come before this body where we've had those sorts of agreements in the American population. The President just wants results. He's charged leadership in this body and the House, and those of us who've been involved in this for some time, to get to it. There's a March 5th deadline looming. Some people say there's a January 19th date that has to do with funding the government. I personally believe that the two have nothing to do with each other. But we want a sense of urgency. The President has demanded it. We need it. But we know there are going to be other steps. This is not the last step to this problem, Mr. President. We know we have to deal with how we bring people in the United States. We need a balance. Of course, we want to continue to be the open arm of the world today in terms of welcoming people on our shores. Just look at what's written on the Statue of Liberty. Who can argue with that? But at the same time, Mr. President, we have to have a balance. Right now, we don't bring in people who are contributing to the economy for the most part. And we're not bringing in people who can contribute. All we're asking for is a dialogue to bring balance back to that system. I also believe that Kate's Law and sanctuary cities need to be dealt with. But in this initial agreement that we're trying to get to, these other issues are coming in as a second phase, as the President has defined. I'm excited to be a part of this dialogue, Mr. President, because I believe we have a unique, historic opportunity with people from the other side and people on this side who generally have hearts that are not that dissimilar with regard to how to deal with the DACA population, how to deal with the Dreamer population, how to deal with future immigrant populations that are coming to the United States. We can have those debates, Mr. President, and we are having them now. I welcome input from all points. I'm anxious to get to the bottom line of this, and I will just close with this, Mr. President. It's exciting to have leadership from the executive branch on this issue that has put the responsibility back on this body to come up with something that will not allow us to be back here in the next 3, 5, or 20 years dealing with this same problem. We have a historic opportunity. It's time to get to it. Thank you, Mr. President. I yield the floor.